March for Life that's taking place in Washington, D.C. And as always, Nebraska sends a huge contingency from both the Omaha Archdiocese and the Lincoln Diocese, bringing these kids into D.C. And I know that you and your staff and the other senators and congressmen make time to go down there to meet with these kids.
Well, frankly, it's one of the most uplifting things that I do, Susan, to see these young people who have been on a bus 20 hours and parents and priests and other chaperones who are too old to be doing that, to make that sacrifice and to be here is really uplifting for me, because they're here to express the heartfelt desire to protect unborn life and to protect women, frankly, from the pain and exploitation of abortion. And to see young people do that really animates the spirit here in Washington. When you have just a political debate about it or a policy debate, that's of course certainly critical. It's critical and certainly has its importance. But when you see young people here who are innocent in heart, who are upholding the values of the idea that every person has inherent dignity and therefore rights, and if we're going to be a truly just society, if we're going to be a society filled with peace and hope and not filled with hate and anger and division, critical to that is protecting the least among us, and that includes the unborn child and women who are in vulnerable vulnerable situations. So I love the time that you get to spend with the kids. And in fact, what we'll do tomorrow night is have them in the Capitol and have a little dialogue with them, and maybe even go on television with them.
It is a great opportunity for these kids too to be able to make a statement, not only to adults but to their peers alike.
You know, the next generation, the millennial generation, is very relational and empathetic. They have different ideas on things than perhaps you and I do, but the core value for them is to have empathy and compassion for others and to be in relationship, and that means community. Our generation has, in some ways, failed by the excesses of individualism and just individual pursuit of goals. And the beautiful thing about the young people is that they believe in that, of course, but it has to be in relationship with others. How does it help or potentially harm others? So they're the pro-life generation that's coming up, because upon this ash heap of devastation, of this wound to America's soul, of approximately 60 million lives being taken and many women being scarred and harmed, by the way, who are coming forward and say, we deserve better than abortion. The young people are just upholding this idea that informs the political system and raises it to a level so that maybe one day we can actually have laws that are just and good and protect all persons.
Looking at the budget, where are we sitting at this point? And is it going to get taken place before we have to have a federal shutdown?
Well, I'm thinking about sending a tweet. Perhaps you could give me your perspective on this tweet. Let's shut down the idea of a shutdown. That doesn't do anyone any good. It's disruptive. It just plays into bad politics. It's not the right way to govern. The current situation is not the right way to govern either. I'm on the Appropriations Committee, and we have frontline responsibility for budgetary decisions and making hard decisions, which we have done all year long. But unfortunately, the great political divide and philosophical divide and the divide between the House and Senate has prohibited the ability for us to move all of those individual bills across the goal. So here we are. We're stuck. We have to do what's called a continuing resolution, probably for a few more weeks, until we can get to a permanent budget for this year, that funds our military adequately, funds important public policies that are necessary to set up the guardrails for a flourishing economy and to protect people's rights, and to create safe conditions in commerce and interaction, while at the same time modernizing and letting go of what is old and ineffective. What I hope doesn't happen is a government shutdown. I think what we can probably do is pass a temporary measure that funds us for a few more weeks, giving space, by the way, for the negotiation over increased border security and creating the conditions in which we can accommodate young people who were brought here against their will and who do not currently have legal status in the United States.
Congressman, we've heard a lot of talk coming out of D.C. that there might be some softening on the president's side when it comes to NAFTA. For so long we've been hearing him talk about wanting to walk away, but now we're hearing possibly that maybe NAFTA's okay, and he's relaxing his thoughts a little bit.
It's a great question. I haven't had proximity to the president to talk to him about this, or haven't been in a meeting with him where he's talked directly about this. However, I was with about 25 members of Congress recently at the Mexican embassy with the Canadian ambassador as well to talk about the dynamics of trade. Trade that is fair and effective helps both peoples to our south, to our north, and to us. Trade that is manipulated actually can become decimating to certain sectors of our economy, and you've seen that with the manufacturing sector particularly. Farmers in Nebraska know the importance of enhanced marketability for our products through trade, and yet at the same time are very sympathetic to making sure that this is also fair. And by the President calling for a reset, I think it's creating the conditions in which we can renegotiate certain aspects of it to make it more in balance, and yet at the same time preserve the heart of the idea of, again, fair and effective trade that is beneficial to all peoples. That was actually the spirit of the conversation as well with the Mexicans and the Canadians about a month ago. I know the President spoke at length to the Farm Bureau Convention. I didn't hear the fullness of his speech, but I assume he touched on that, and I assume that's where your comments are coming from, that there appears to be a softening.
He also talked while he was at Farm Bureau, since you brought up Farm Bureau, about rural broadband and the need to continue to expand and get some good qualified broadband out there to continue to grow rural America.
Yeah, it's a very important point, particularly in terms of 21st century architecture of economic regeneration and ensuring that rural communities are not left behind. One of the great equalizers out there is the Internet, but you have to have access to it and competition for it as well so that you don't have monopolistic control over it. So anything we can do to continue to expand rural broadband actually creates conditions in which people who have a heartfelt desire to live in the heart of America in our rural communities and be proximate to farming and agriculture and all the wonderful things that happen in smaller communities have a level playing field with those in urban communities, particularly the coast. One of the things that I would like to add, though, that I'm hopeful we can think through creatively is not just policies that fit the traditional debate about farm country and what we do with trade or broadband or support mechanisms for various commodities. It's the issue of net farm income, and one of the biggest hits on net farm income right now is the lack of access to affordable health care. I hear it all the time. It's not just among the farm community, but particularly among small businesses, but the inability for a farmer and the family to have good, affordable health care that's necessarily protective is a serious strain on their revenue or a deteriorating effect as to whether or not they can even stay in small business or potentially in farming without one spouse going off and working for an institution that provides benefits. That's not fair. That's an entrepreneurial drain. It is hitting the agricultural sector very hard, as well as small business. If we want to revive our economy, if we want to have a revival of entrepreneurial momentum, a new economic regeneration, it's this issue of affordability of health care that is one of the biggest drains. And by the way, I did a farm survey recently and tried to touch everybody in the district who is involved directly or indirectly with agriculture. And we've got a number of good comments back, but some of which, again, concern the issue of health care and affordability. I'm hopeful that the next Farm Bill, actually we can delve into that deeper, and we're actually working on a bipartisan fix for the individual market, and I'm hopeful that the rest of Congress awakens to the harsh reality that this is really needed.
Is the Tax Cut and Jobs Act going to be a benefit to rural Nebraska?
Yes. Of course, there's certain controversies with it, but I think overall in the aggregate, this is going to be very helpful to the economy. Individual families, for the most part, are getting a tax reduction. It will add economic momentum to America as a whole. So I think on balance, it was the right thing to do.
Now, you introduced the Wildlife Act most recently. Tell us what that's all about.
Recovering America's Wildlife Act is a creative and imaginative approach to a new public policy that actually helps the federal government partner with states, fund what are called mandated wildlife management plans by using some money that's coming from our resource extraction, minerals that are taken off of federal lands, the royalties that are gained from that would then be plowed back into the development of habitat and recreation areas in voluntary partnership with farmers and landowners, creating the conditions for more angling, better hunting, better recreation, and the preservation of species that could potentially become endangered. By creating a continuity of habitat, you avoid the emergency room procedures in invoking of the Endangered Species Act, which then creates all types of heavy-handed responses and ties up things in courts, and then creates the conditions in which the wildlife in of itself is not protected because it gets so entangled bureaucratically. So these are ability to walk upstream, an attempt to walk upstream and create the conditions in which, again, we're creating more habitat with continuity in voluntary partnership with landowners, managed by the state, enlarging the opportunities, again, for hunting and recreation as well as ecosystem diversity. This is a win-win-win, and we've got sportsmen's groups behind this. We've got environmental groups who are interested in this, and it's going to save the government potentially a lot of money by a little upfront investment by avoiding the Endangered Species Act, and it's simply the right thing to do.
And finally, we all know that you continue to fight like you do for veterans, and I know that there's been a push by veterans in Washington, D.C. to get more assistance and help when it comes to the after effects of Agent Orange and what they're seeing. And have you had some discussions with veterans and some things that they'd like to see done?
Well, I know that the Department of Veteran Affairs is considering adding 6 new suspected diseases to the list of illnesses that were caused by Agent Orange, and I think that's important. I'm also a co-sponsor of what's called the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act, and this would expand benefits for Vietnam veterans who are currently suffering from diseases that are correlated with their time in service. So I like the Veterans Secretary, David Shulkin. I am the vice chairman of what's called the Subcommittee on Military Construction and Veterans Affairs on the Appropriations Committee. In other words, we give the checks. We give the money to the VA and for military projects. I saw him recently at the White House. He came bounding across the room quickly to ask me an individual question about an ongoing issue regarding a VA clinic. What that said to me is that he is highly sensitive and attentive down to the individual district of the congressman, and I'm really grateful for that. So we all know the challenges the VA has gone through. Fortunately, in Nebraska, that hasn't been as severe as in other places, and in fact, we rank very highly in terms of surveys of veterans' preferred outcomes, and I'm proud of that. But we're undertaking a project in Lincoln to build out the new innovative clinic there and the one in Omaha as well. But the issue you raise has been raised for a very long time, and I think there is new movement to look at the effects of Agent Orange and how they have caused really debilitating diseases that were previously either just rejected or swept under the rug. And I'm glad you continue to raise the issue.